So, both with high-dose ketamine and psilocybin, a lot of people attest to experiencing what's known as ego dissolution or ego death, which, again, can be harrowing for someone who hasn't had that, for the first time, to really kind of lose your sense of self.
Yep.
But in a lot of ways, it can lead to this deep feeling of calm and interconnectedness with the universe as well. And I think it lowers a lot of neuroticism, that is for sure. But kind of a deeper contentment overall is where you come out on the backside. But for a lot of people, especially if you have what's known as mental rigidity, people who are kind of fall into that subpopulation have a tougher time responding. So it can be tougher to let go and really sink into that experience. But that is like the most therapeutic kind of subjective effect with psilocybin and ketamine. And there's a rating that we call peak mysticism, where you kind of achieve a mystical state in a way, and it's sort of a questionnaire that people can attest to. And if they achieve that, it usually correlates very heavily with a strong, durable therapeutic effect. MDMA is very different in that it's not dissociative, it's not hallucinogenic in any way.
Health, fitness, mindset, nutrition. Live better and longer. I'm Saad Alam, and let's hone in.
I am so excited to have Tim Schlidt with us here. Tim is the founder and managing partner of Palo Santo's Ventures, which you're going to get into very shortly, and actually now a close friend. We randomly met each other, have gone on 2 vacations within the span of a month.
A couples retreat in there as well. So our girlfriends have met. It's like, fast friendship.
Fast friendship. And we live in the same city. Who would have ever thought that was going to happen, too?
Yeah.
And we went to dinner last night, too.
Yeah. There we go.
It's funny how quickly things can come together in the right circumstances. And so I'm excited to have you on today.
Thank you.
I know even more so, a lot of the guys here are incredibly geeked about this entire conversation. Tell us what you guys do.
Yeah, so we're a venture capital fund, seed, Series A stage, that invests across the psychedelic universe. So we were founded back in 2021 and just closed on our $50 million Fund 1 and have been very active in kind of backing early transformative companies in this space. And we got in now, it's certainly in the zeitgeist. We got in at a time when it was much less cool to get in, but we felt like there was a need for rigorous technical due diligence and bringing real scientific rigor to the space. So we primarily back a lot of biotech companies, and our focus is largely on early stage drug discovery within psychedelics.
That is such a crazy thing to get into. And how did you decide all of a sudden one day I'm going to put together a $50 million fund to go back psychedelics?
Yeah, I came out of an ayahuasca journey, and I was like, all right, here, no, it was a long journey. So I got in. Well, I'll start with this. First off, I've had a deep attachment to mental health my whole life.
Yep.
So had my own run with severe depression back in high school. So long time ago, but it's a deep, dark anhedonia that no one should ever have to go through. So always had a fascination with psychiatry. And fast forward to 2018, started looking into alternate modalities for treating depression outside of antidepressants, which carry a whole host of nasty side effects. I think they're kind of a necessary evil is how some people view them. And there was a lot of really compelling research around psychedelics for treating depression out of Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, you name it. So really reputable universities. And I went, holy crap, there's something here, something to really look at more deeply. I come from a healthcare background as well, within finance, but focused on life sciences. So kept pursuing that, and then fast forward 2-3 years later, launched the fund, kind of off of the network we built and the sourcing pipeline that we'd cultivated.
Yeah, it's great to hear when someone has a personal story that's the thing that actually drove them. I mean, I don't know if you guys know this, but we kind of started the business because I went through this problem. And interestingly, someone in my family, my immediate family, had bipolar their entire life. And so I went and ran a $4 billion brand. And so I understand that is the thing that actually drives you and allows you to kind of just be so much more empathetic with the folks that you're helping out. So I got to ask you this, you've been doing it now for 3 years?
Almost 5.
Almost
actually.
5.
Yeah.
That's a long time. You get to see
It's a lot of drugs. It's a lot of psychedelics.
It's a lot of and I've got to imagine you're also making sure that the product works before you're investing behind it.
Don't knock it till you try it. So
don't knock it till you try it.
And I will say, as part of that journey in a deep passion for these. Early on, I started with psilocybin, was the first modality, found a great guide, which I do think anyone who who wants to work with these, I cannot offer medical advice, but if someone is going to do it, they should absolutely have a trained therapist and had an incredibly transformative experience. So a big time believer in the therapeutic potential of these.
100%. The one thing I just want to just touch on, you get to see the newest research out there. What's, I think, maybe the most interesting stuff that you're seeing that the rest of the world doesn't even know about yet?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think it's lesser known, but the neuroplasticity hypothesis around psychedelics, I think, is really, really interesting. So there's a lot of really good evidence that, when people are in a depressed state, there's kind of a neuronal atrophying. So if you imagine a tree, for example, and it's like the branches are withering in a way. So if you look at a neuron, the branches are what are called dendritic spines. They start to atrophy. And when we administer psychedelics, we certainly observe this in rodent models, but you get a lot of regrowth. So what we call dendritogenesis is the term. But imagine kind of a tree going back to a healthy state. It's very lush. There's a lot of branches back on it, a lot of new neural connections, which I think is really interesting. And there are some companies pioneering work in that. There's one we're invested in called Therapeutics, working on trying to tweak molecules to make them highly neuroplastic. So really kind of juice the dendritogenic quality of those drugs.
And when you take an SSRI or you take any other kind of, we'll call it drug specifically aimed at mental health, does it have the same exact quality?
I think there's, SSRIs have gone through kind of a meandering route of what the true mechanism is. Some people have hypothesized, are they somewhat anti-inflammatory? I think there's been some talk of could you see, some neuronal regrowth, but I don't think the neurogenesis we see with SSRIs is nearly on par with what we see with psychedelics.
And how big is that neurogenesis? 10%, 5%?
It's interesting. I had quantifying it. I don't know off the top of my head. I do know the analysis done is what's called a shoal analysis. So you look at a neuron and there's kind of rings. Imagine like rings on a tree, and the more they grow out, kind of the more goalposts they pass. That's a marker of enhanced neurogenesis. So psychedelics are very potent by that assessment, but quantitatively, I'd have a tough time boxing it in off the top of my head.
And would it be fair to say that if I took a lot of psychedelics very often, that I would pass more of these goalposts, or is that a bold statement?
Maybe don't take it too far. They have done tests in rodents of like giving them LSD daily for like months, and they become incredibly violent. So don't do these too often. I think these are definitely designed to be intermittent. But one thing I will say, as you track, we've seen this of kind of like someone below a healthy baseline, when they're in a depressed state, and post-psychedelic experience, and I'm talking traditional psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, they go way above it. So you kind of get this regrowth. They go way above, if you imagine kind of the mean, they go above it. And then there's a bit of a pruning that the brain goes through, but they don't go back below a healthy baseline. They actually go back to a healthy, normal state, which I think is really interesting as well. And it seems to stay that way for a very long time. It's very durable with traditional psychedelics. Ketamine is a different story. That's kind of in its own camp. You sort of go above and then you return, and that's why people usually have to repeat dose ketamine more often, usually every 2 weeks to 4 weeks.
So when you talk about psychedelics, what are those different categories?
So the big ones, so there are some purists in the field who would say like psilocybin, LSD, DMT are true psychedelics and things in that camp. And the way we think of them is they're serotonergic drugs. So they operate on serotonin receptors. And there's 14 different subtypes of serotonin receptors. They're very potent at a specific one called the 5-HT2A receptor, so serotonin 2A receptor. So that's what a lot of purists would say is you branch out from that, and we do a bit at Palo Santo, because that would be a really, really siloed bet if we were to only bet on those. So ketamine operates on what are called glutamatergic targets. So it's NMDA receptors. It blocks an excitatory neurotransmitter called glutamate. So very different, but you do go into a highly dissociated state, which a lot of people will say rhymes to a great degree with psychedelics. And then beyond that, ibogaine is another one a lot of people talk about. It primarily operates on kappa opioid receptors, so more of an opioid antagonist, but it is a very dirty molecule. So some people think it hits 5-HT2A and other targets.
When you talk about dissociative, what does that exactly mean? I've heard people talk about it all the time, specifically in regards to ketamine, but what is that? What is the experience like?
Yeah, it's, I mean, subjectively, there's visual effects, of course. I wouldn't describe it as hallucinogenic. You know, you're not seeing anything. And even with traditional psychedelics, rarely do people really see things that aren't there. Things can take on a wavy quality, stuff like that. But internally, the brain goes into sort of a more entropic state. Like you're able to evaluate pathways you normally wouldn't. It helps people kind of shut in. With a lot of these, we see a shutting off of what's called the default mode network. So again, the brain really lights up. A lot of regions that don't normally communicate begin to communicate with each other. And for a lot of people, I think the best way to describe it is it's like psychotherapy on steroids. It's like taking hours, you know, what would be months of psychotherapy and condensing it to a few hours. Now, I'm kind of generalizing between ketamine and traditional psychedelics, but you know, different people respond differently to different drugs. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, but some people prefer ketamine, others traditional psychedelics.
And so is it fair to say that what traditional therapy forces you to do is connect different parts of your brain or make associations between events that you normally would have, and that psychedelics actually just accelerates that process, or are they two separate things?
I think some people would certainly say that. I mean, if you think of therapy as kind of getting more to the roots of what's really, you know, driving some qualm or driving a mental health disorder, you know, an ability to really cut through a lot of the brush and really get to the heart of a matter, I think psychedelics do help that. And part of that shutting down of the default mode network, a bit of kind of, you know, toning the mind down to not block out what you're normally blocking out, I think certainly helps. There's also a pharmacology to this, so there's a biological substrate, without a doubt. But I do think people think the psychotherapeutic quality certainly helps and enhances these in a lot of ways. And
then even outside of psychotherapy, and we're going to even dive into a second here, further into that, what are the other therapeutic uses?
So one thing we didn't hit on, I mean, we talked about neuroplasticity is kind of one hypothesis and one mechanism here. You know, another really interesting one, we have one of our scientific advisors, Chuck Nichols, has done a lot of pioneering research in this field and discovered this, but a lot of traditional psychedelics are potently anti-inflammatory as well. So there could be uses beyond even neuropsychiatry, which could be really compelling. I mean, Western diets, Western lifestyles, highly inflammatory. So, you know, a lot of psychedelics at very low doses as well temper that inflammation to a great degree. So at subperceptual doses, many do. Not all of them, which is interesting. So LSD doesn't. Psilocybin does seem to be pretty potent. And then what are known as the phenethylamines, so stuff in kind of the mescaline family. So peyote cactus, the San Pedro cactus are kind of the plants that comes from. That seems to be very, very anti-inflammatory and stuff with kind of that general chemical scaffold, which I think is interesting.
So is it also crazy to say that there may be a pill that we take every day when I take my vitamins in the morning that is subperceptual dose that actually helps reduce inflammation in my body?
Potentially, yes. The one rate limiting factor I will say, and we'll probably get into a microdosing discussion later, is so psychedelics hit what I called 5-HT2A. There are homologous receptors, so there's 5-HT2B, which is heavily expressed on the heart. And so active, prolonged use of psychedelics could induce some cardiac adverse events, would be the only thing. So some people are trying to engineer that out. There is a bit of medchem where you probably, in one of our scientific advisors, John McCorvey, had a really seminal paper on this of ways you can tweak some of these molecules to really block 5-HT2B effect. So folks are working on that. So maybe, you know, that would certainly be potentially conducive to a daily pill. But then you also do develop tolerance as well to many of these, even at the 2A receptor, which seems to mediate a lot of the therapeutic effect. So those are some of the rate limiting factors. A lot of what we're betting on at Palo Santo is the Gen 2 of psychedelics, so moving away from the ones we know from the 50s and 60s, and this next gen with an optimized pharmacology that could solve for some of those rate limiting factors.
So is it basically taking molecules that have already existed, that we know how they operate, and saying how do we modify them in some manner, and that should theoretically maybe only target H2A versus 2B?
Yeah, that would be one. Exactly. And there could be other serotonin targets. You can get into polypharmacology, which gets the combinatorics gets really complex. But that's the idea, is we think we know kind of the key receptor targets that seem to mediate therapeutic effect. And there's been a lot of studies to kind of validate that. If you block it, you don't get therapeutic effect, and you unblock it, and then you do. There's 2A blockers. So how do you engineer drugs exactly to do that? Be more targeted, not have the deleterious off-target effects.
Okay.
Well.
So now let's actually kind of shift to what maybe I'll call like execution, right? Let's just say that, actually, let's start here. What is a microdose?
So it's an interesting debate because some people would what a microdose should truly be a subperceptual dose. So a dose you take where you don't feel any psychoactive effects, whatever. What's tough is when people claim to have therapeutic benefit from microdosing, you get into this world of, okay, where are they feeling a low dose? Are they feeling something that's mood elevating or not? So there's a bit of kind of chicken and egg or a circular problem to that. But technically it should be a dose level in which it's subperceptual. You're not feeling any effects from the psychedelic, but there could be other health benefits. We hit on inflammation at low doses. I mean, some people anecdotally do claim to get a lot of benefit. At the same time, there's been research to suggest, in controlled studies, it may not carry that much benefit. There may be a lot of placebo involved.
So basically you're saying if it's a subperceptual dose, if I go to my therapist and I say I want to do ketamine-assisted therapy, I wouldn't feel any of the effects or the dissociation you're talking about, but by having a normal conversation and it working on some kind of very maybe subconscious level, it should theoretically work out better for me.
Potentially, ketamine would kind of be its own beast. I would say with psilocybin, that's the idea, is low dose, you shouldn't feel it, but some people do claim to have health benefits. And I've talked to folks who suffer from severe depression, and they claim that it completely clears up when they microdose, and then when they shut it off, then it seems to return. So it does seem to return pretty quickly. So you run into all these issues of there's a lot of high placebo response in anything around neuropsychiatry, so that can confound a lot of the data, and there's a lot of patient heterogeneity, as we said. So there could be subpopulations of patients that do respond really well, so the patient selection wasn't optimized in these studies. It's tough to know.
So I'm such a big believer in that, because when guys come to us and say, what does testosterone feel like? What does it feel like taking Clomid or an anastrozole? What is a hormone optimization game? And I say, listen, it is different for every single person. The way you feel at 660 testosterone level is very different than the way I feel. The way my personality comes out is very different. So if it's not a microdose per se, and it's not a macrodose, because that's probably the wrong direction, or maybe sometimes it is a macrodose, it's low dose, and I think that's the word you use. So low dose therapeutic gives you a therapeutic benefit. It makes you feel different. If I wanted to get started, right? Let's say I'm a guy, I've tried multiple SSRIs, I feel depressed. Some people would actually classify that as TRD, treatment-resistant depression, or maybe I have PTSD and everything that I've done hasn't really helped my life. How do I get myself involved in some of these therapies?
Yeah, I mean, where the data is good around especially treatment-resistant indications is to go for the high-dose experience. So for treatment-resistant depression, there's a lot of work on psilocybin right now. There's a company, Compass Pathways, which is in phase 3 clinical trials for that, for treatment-resistant depression. Around PTSD, MDMA is incredibly effective, which has a different pharmacology that we can get into, but very effective for treating PTSD. But these are high-dose sessions where you have a therapist involved. There is more cost involved, but there's a lot of therapist oversight, a lot of psychotherapy that goes along with it. But the data is really compelling. I mean, around PTSD, it's a little over 2/3 of patients suffering from treatment-resistant PTSD are in long-term remission after MDMA therapy. So after 1 or 2 administrations of MDMA. The data around psilocybin, not quite as good, but still really compelling and definitely beats placebo. But these are treatment-resistant populations, so a lot more refractory to any pharmacotherapies.
What does that mean, refractory?
Just that they kind of bounce back into their depressed state. So it's any sort of medications it's tougher to treat them with. But the data around psilocybin definitely better than SSRIs for treatment-resistant depression. Now MDD, very, very effective, and the data is much better there.
And MDD is major depressive disorder, right?
Yeah. If you kind of imagine concentric circles, so this was pre-COVID. There were about 300 million people worldwide suffering from major depressive disorder, and then the smaller subset, about 1/3 of that, 100 million, were treatment-resistant. So, in which to qualify as treatment-resistant, you have to have not responded to 2 pharmacotherapies, so 2 different regimens of medication, which would be SSRIs in this case.
I mean, that's a big number. 100 million people that try an SSRI and they still feel depressed at the end of the day.
Yeah. It kind of shows the paltry track record of SSRIs, quite frankly. And that was also pre-COVID. Post-COVID, a lot of these figures have skyrocketed by 2 or 3x. So our estimate is close to 1 billion people worldwide suffering from probably some sort of major depressive disorder. Now, varying degrees. You think about treatment resistant, that could be 200, 300 million.
And the most interesting thing, the moment you tell me 1 billion people, right? I think about the fact that people stigmatize mental health so much. And the reality is we all have some kind of mental health. I hate to use the word issue because it's not really an issue. It's just very often an imbalance. And that leads us to think very different ways. With 1 billion people, it's one of the most common things, right? You're talking about like 1/6 of the entire population that ends up having it. Maybe like 1/8, but that's 10, 12% of the world's population. That's huge.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. And I think it's, 1 in 4 people say at some point in their life they suffer from a major health disorder. I think that was in the United States, but it impacts a lot of people, at some point. And, there's lifestyle, there's a lot of factors that can influence it. And if lifestyle changes, some of that can clear up. But I think everyone's been touched by this, or at least everyone has a close family member or loved one who suffered.
1 billion people, maybe worldwide, 200 million people with treatment-resistant depression. Psilocybin feels like the thing for the majority of the masses because it's a little bit, we'll call it gentler maybe. Is that the right way to describe it?
I would say so. I mean, ketamine is probably the gentlest.
Interesting.
I think a lot of people, again, varies from patient to patient, but I think a lot of people think ketamine is one of the more palatable ones. If you're going to go for a larger dose, is kind of a jumping off point, at least as an introduction to a hallucinogenic or dissociative type experience. Psilocybin, it can be harrowing at times. That you kind of go through the valley of death sometimes in a journey, but when you come out on the back end, it can be incredibly enlightening. But and it's a big commitment too. 6 hours to be tripping balls, pardon my French. It's a lot of time. Where ketamine, 1 to 2, it's at least you can get off the ride if you're not enjoying it.
What does that mean? Like the valley of hell? Actually, help me understand. Right, take ketamine, take psilocybin, and take MDMA, and walk me through each of those journeys in a therapeutic session. What I should actually expect.
I mean, it's really, you're just releasing endogenous neurotransmitters, which is what, Adderall does. Now, you're doing it in different ratios. So you're releasing a lot more serotonin. Adderall's dopamine, norepinephrine. But the mechanism rhymes in some ways. So you're very lucid. There's a quality with MDMA where you kind of get a shutting down of the amygdala as well. And there's an effect that we call hyponesia. So amnesia, you kind of forget things or suppress memories. Here, you allow a lot of times traumatic memories to bubble up, but the amygdala isn't activated, so you're not in a fearful state, and you're really able to evaluate those traumas in depth and kind of live through them and process them. And there's been a lot of studies around PTSD where it's kind of an inability to process a really traumatic experience. I know they've looked at folks when they sleep as well, that again, the brain is kind of misfiring. It's not really in a truly rested state. And then when you're in a wakeful state, a trauma bubbles up. You kind of go into a fight or flight state and try to suppress it. So MDMA kind of shuts that off, allows you to evaluate it much more objectively. And a lot of people attest to being better after 1 or 2 experiences of that.
So maybe I have to be really careful how I take this step, right? Let's say I'm a soldier. I've been in war. I've seen someone very close to me injured dramatically. Very often when I think about that, or I take that memory that was absolutely, in your words, harrowing, and I push it down throughout my entire life. And every time it comes up, I have this jolting experience where I'm uncomfortable. It was a horrible moment. I feel like I'm unsafe. But when I'm on something like MDMA, I let that memory come up. I can objectively look at it without the emotions being attached to it, and I can rationally say, I'm okay now. I shouldn't let that thing bother me. And then at that point in time, does it go away, or is this the kind of thing where you need to consistently do it to analyze it? And I have a good feeling what you're going to say is it's all case dependent, but is there any research one way or another?
Most of the research suggests 2 administrations of MDMA. just for, to be really sure. But a lot of people respond to just one. But after that, they're in long-term remission. So they no longer register as having PTSD afterwards. So, there is a little bit of case by case. Again, there's a lot of patient heterogeneity. So there are some non-responders, but a lot of people do after, one, kind of the typical regimen. And then they can go on and live a relatively healthy, normal life afterwards, which is pretty remarkable that you don't have to be stuck on medications your whole life. You think of the effect on family members, all of that you're not managing symptoms, but you really seem to be addressing root causes of the disease.
The dinner we were at last night, there was a gentleman there that talked about the passing of his father, right? And he said that I did a guided therapeutic journey, and I was able to process the death of my father within several weeks to a month, versus we're now 6 months out and he's consistently going through, other people are consistently going through that pain. And the other thing that was really interesting is, and I would say sad, because I also experienced the loss of my father recently too, is that I had a year to say goodbye to my father. His happened without ever knowing, right? And so speak to me a little bit about when people take psilocybin, specifically in therapeutic sessions. What does that experience look like, and what is the therapist doing to help them actually deal with that trauma and pain?
Yeah, it is interesting. I think a lot of traditional psychedelics are great with dealing with loss, without a doubt. But so prior to a psilocybin session, there's usually some very rigorous, what we call pre-integration. So talking with the therapist, kind of making an assessment, of what's kind of driving someone's depression or mental health disorder. What are kind of the key qualms to it? What are some of the psychotherapeutic roots of that? So, it provides a bit of a blueprint and a map prior to the experience. And then going into the experience, in a perfect world, the therapist doesn't have to do much and the patient doesn't need a lot of hand-holding, and they kind of go to where they need to go. But usually the therapist is there. They can be a bit of a guide. So, eventually, being able to calmly bring up a topic that was brought up prior that they may want to evaluate. But more typically, you kind of let the patient be on their own. They put an eye mask over, which is really helpful. You're playing calming music as well, which is conducive to a psychedelic state. And I think the biggest thing, what they usually say is when you have a fearful experience in a psychedelic journey, don't run away from it. Kind of don't run away from the monster. Yeah, go into it. Exactly. And so oftentimes if a patient is struggling or some fear starts bubbling up, it's really nice to have a therapist there who is able to handle that, kind of calm them down, and also encourage them to go deeper and evaluate that, which is usually where you get really deep therapeutic benefit. So I'd say that's the primary role. You could have adverse events. People could get very scared. Therapists are trained on how to manage that and navigate that. But that's more for adverse events. Most patients, are totally fine.
And then what about, there's this entire word around integrating the experience. What does that even mean?
Yeah, it is kind of an amorphous term. It really is psychotherapy. So you have the pre-integration, and then after you have your experience, a lot of times you're like, what the F was that? What just happened? Like that was mind blowing. What did I just go through? And so afterwards, making sense of that, really solidifying some of the key lessons as well, kind of codifying those, making those more concrete, is where post-integration plays a really big role. So the therapist is there as well. And, the therapist can take notes and usually bring up things that came up in your session that you may have even forgotten. So it's really integrating, everything that happened, kind of the key lessons, the key insights that hopefully you can carry with you for a long period of time.
If I'm a patient, how do I evaluate the different options out there? Is there one that you specifically speak very highly of?
So the one company we're invested in and that we think is the safest bet is called Journey Clinical.
Yep.
So what they do is they connect patients with psychotherapists, or there may already be a relationship there, but usually the psychotherapist doesn't have access to a compound pharmacy to get their patient ketamine, and then also get trained up to offer ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. So there's a lot more oversight involved in that, whereas there are some other models. I don't want to name names or pick on people, but other models where they just kind of send you ketamine and you go on your merry way, which I think is very dangerous.
Hold on, no therapeutic session, just here's ketamine?
Sometimes no. So there's one company where, there's a trip sitter involved. You sort of find a designated trip sitter, but that could be your roommate or your neighbor down the hallway, which if someone's not experienced in what that looks like, the odds of them freaking out and calling the cops or something are pretty high. Like that doesn't seem safe. And I've heard some crazy stories too of people like crushing up their lozenge and snorting it. And things like that. Like there's no oversight. It's kind of the Wild West there. So our bet is there's going to be a big regulatory crackdown in just the risk of patient harm, even if it's still low. You want very, very tight controls. So Journey Clinical's the bet we've made, and we think that's the safest. I do think a trained therapist, a trained guide should be involved in the process with something. This isn't cannabis. These are strong drugs.
And so there's no MDMA, no psilocybin at this point in time that's been actually legalized for use, but we're almost there.
Yeah, we're almost there. It still will be in person. So MDMA, MAPS has wrapped up their phase 3 clinical trials. So that should be on the market. We're anticipating maybe late 2024, early 2025 is what it looks like. Next in line is psilocybin. Compass Pathways is going into phase 3 clinical trials. So we're probably looking at 2026 or 2027 that hits the market. But those will be, there will be a lot of active oversight. You'll go to a clinic of some kind and have a therapist involved. I don't see those going telehealth anytime soon.
And so 2024, 25, 26, 27, we're right around the corner from a lot of this stuff happening. And so it is kind of, a lot of us are holding our breath until maybe some of the more potent ones, as you said, kind of like ketamine, easiest, then probably psilocybin, then MDMA, although MDMA would probably get approved before psilocybin.
It will be. Yeah, it will. That's what it's looking like. So, which is pretty crazy that like ecstasy, you can go to a psychiatrist one day and be like, hey, I have PTSD. And they're like, I'm going to prescribe you MD, like Molly.
I do have a weird question. So someone, I'm not going to say who,
asking for a friend.
Asking for a friend, they have really bad migraines. They get them all the time.
Yeah.
Can any of these products that you're talking about actually help with something like that?
It looks like it. Migraines, and then there's cluster headaches, which there's some overlap. There seems to be maybe a slightly different mechanism at play with cluster headaches, but still, excruciating, piercing migraine type symptoms. They all rhyme in that way. Definitely within cluster headaches, people attest to a lot of benefit, even from microdosing, like psilocybin, for example, or LSD, or there's an analog known as 2-bromo-LSD, which actually isn't psychoactive, and some people have been working on that as well for treating migraine, which would be, when you think about it, that would be really compelling. Sometimes you don't want to trip balls all the time to treat your migraines. You still want to be active, so 2-bromo could be really compelling. But there's a lot of really good anecdotal evidence around the benefit of these for treating migraine. They also, the pharmacology is interesting. They hit so triptans are what are currently on the market for treating migraines. These do, and that operates on serotonergic targets as well, more in the 5-HT1 class. But psychedelics have some overlap there. So there might be a similar pharmacology as well that would explain that. But people have gotten, I've talked to people who've gotten tremendous benefit, and they haven't responded to existing drugs on the market, but have with psychedelics.
And so does that mean, though, are you taking it once, like your psilocybin, MDMA, you get to a very high supraphysiological dose, and then all of a sudden it's gone, you return to a baseline, or do you have to do it a little bit more often, or do you just take microdoses on a regular basis?
Some people have said microdoses. There was one company, they're called Beckley Psytech. They were pursuing an orphan indication within cluster headaches, and they were going to do kind of a medium dose. Like it would be, let's say the equivalent to, of like raw mushrooms would be like half a gram to maybe a gram, but that's probably too much, where you feel it, but you're not totally out in la la land. So there's been different.
Not every day.
Not every day. This
day.
would be more, as migraine symptoms, or in this case, cluster headache symptoms start to percolate, you'd go to a clinic, administer it, and hopefully you kind of get a long-term therapeutic tail for a period of time with that. So I've seen different regimens, some pulsing with microdosing, others that kind of medium dose. You do it once and the symptoms clear up for at least that sort of episode of an attack.
And so talk to me about, right now, right, if you wanted to microdose mushrooms, very often your people are quite literally getting caps and stems or grinding them down and putting them into like pretty crude capsules, right?
Yeah.
The future of this, what does it look like? Is it completely high quality manufactured in pharmaceutical, I would say quality and manufacturing plants, or is it really, this is the world we live in and it's just going to be these kind of like sketchy looking caps? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, other people have like been talking about injecting some of these things.
Yeah, I know we talked about that beforehand. So, well, I'll start with the injection. One guy did inject himself with mushroom spores, and he started growing mushrooms in his whole body. Do not do that. So,
wait, hold on. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, that is true. There was, this was like 3 years ago, some guy, I think he wanted to like permanently trip or something, and terrible idea. That just like invokes The Last of Us. I don't know if you've seen that show, but literally like spores growing in your body. But he did try to inject psilocybin spores. Not a good idea. Definitely not a good idea. But the future we see at Palo Santo, I think this might be a controversial thing to say, but I think cannabis has been really messy. A lot of people would attest it's just been a very, very messy rollout from a regulatory standpoint, being state compliant, not federal compliant. Again, the quality is suspect, and a lot of times you don't really have standards. There aren't a lot of validated medical claims. So, we don't want to repeat a lot of the same mistakes that happened there with psychedelics. Also, these are very, very strong drugs as well. So, they are potent. There's a lot of therapeutic benefit, but, like we mentioned, they can be harrowing as well. So I think having tighter controls, having a more pharmaceutical model around these makes a lot more sense. And part of that, quality control is a big thing. So the FDA has a very, very high bar on the standards of quality any pharmaceutical manufacturer should have. It's what's called GMP grade, good manufacturing practices. So it's very high purity. And I do think knowing the dosing you're getting and the quality of that is very, very important to patients when you're dealing with incredibly strong medications like these. So a lot of the future we see, there is a recreational market, or I'll call it a legalization market, because we can talk about the nuances. There aren't dispensaries in Oregon or Colorado. It is emerging. I think that'll be slower than people think. And if you go a biotech pathway, even if it's a scheduled compound, if you get it FDA approved, the DEA then reschedules that. And there's a lot of precedent that occurs. So we actually think that's a much better Trojan horse way to get these to market, and with validated medical claims, and a safer way as well that avoids adverse events for patients.
So you think they fall into schedule, I'm guessing, a lot of these would probably be classified scheduled 1 and 2. Is that a crazy statement?
Currently schedule 1.
Schedule 1,
for all psychedelics, yeah.
And so for people that kind of know that or don't understand the scheduling system, scheduling 1 means like you should not be taking these products because they're very often dangerous or they can actually harm your life. Yeah. Although some of these seem to be incredibly useful for your life. Schedule 2 are things like Adderall. Schedule 3 are things like testosterone or buprenorphine.
Ketamine.
Ketamine. Yep, not narcotic.
I think Schedule 3. I don't know. It starts to get, it's kind of, once you go from Schedule 3, 4, 5, doesn't make as big of a difference.
And so do you think these things get pulled down eventually, and so you're able to prescribe them far easier?
They definitely would. So definitely at least to Schedule 2. So the criteria for Schedule 1, I'm kind of simplifying it, but it's really, no known medical use case and significant risk of harm to the user and risk of abuse.
Yep.
So, if you find a medical use case, which you would validate that through double-blind, placebo-controlled FDA clinical trials, by definition, you no longer meet Schedule 1 criteria. Now, whether you're 2 or 3, there's a big open debate on where these would fall. A lot of people think it should be 3. Cocaine falls within Schedule 2. So, it can be an effective numbing agent, things like that. I think a lot of people would attest psychedelics do not have a harm profile nearly on par with cocaine or even Adderall potentially, which is an amphetamine, quite frankly. Now, whether cultural effects, prior stigmatization plays a role in where they fall and where the DEA puts them, we're not exactly sure. But they definitely will get rescheduled to a lower scheduling. There will be a known medical use case, and they can then be used. It just kind of determines, the scheduling can determine the controls around them.
I can remember like 5 years ago talking about some of these things with people was completely taboo. No one would mention it.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, I'm quite literally with I would say, the chairman of some of the biggest companies in the country, and I can think of one guy very specifically, we'll say a top 50, Fortune 50 company, most conservative guy I met, and told me that he recently did, quite literally, every single week for 24 weeks, psilocybin-assisted therapy, and he was able to finally figure out how to fix the problems from his childhood, which helped him relieve so much anxiety that he was having. And I think it's just actually becoming like a badge of empowerment to a certain degree. And I think you're right. When you say zeitgeist, we're in it. Like, we're literally living in it right now. These conversations are happening. I actually think a lot of momentum is generated before these even get approved by the FDA. It's just a function of, we need to get it done.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of blocking and tackling involved getting it done. That's a remarkable story too. But I do think for kind of leadership training or enhancing leadership, a lot of people find benefit of these. I mean, there's a lot of retreats in Costa Rica and Jamaica, semi-legal jurisdictions that you hear, a lot of CEOs going to and getting a lot of benefit from. So that would check out in a lot of ways. So I think there's a zeitgeist. I do get a little concerned that it's almost taking on a panacea like quality right now in the media, which is like you set yourself up for failure of, nothing is an ultimate miracle drug. I do think oftentimes, these can catalyze lifestyle changes, but if you have a lifestyle that is not conducive to mental health long term, you're probably going to rebound ultimately. So you run into some of those confounding factors that I do think these can be a really kind of nice catalyst, can really, lead patients to changing a lot about their life. But, they're not going to fix everything. So.
I'm really happy you said that, because I think a lot of times when guys come to us, they think that testosterone is a silver bullet. Yeah. And what we actually tell them is that there actually are no silver bullets. The only silver bullets are lifestyle changes that you make consciously and then integrate into your life consistently for the rest of it. It's real work. And the way to look at something like testosterone is that if you're in a low point in your life where you don't feel like yourself anymore, it gives you a little bit of momentum. What you choose to do with that momentum is actually kind of your path to enlightenment, to become a better version of yourself. But I mean, make no mistakes. This isn't you take some testosterone or Clomid and all of a sudden you feel like a different person tomorrow. It's you have to actually take the energy you're given and start crafting it. I think it's very similar with what you're talking about too, which isn't a one and done. If you have mental health, I would say that you need to have taken care of, it is a lifelong, I got to take care of myself regularly.
Yeah, I agree. I thought you were going to say just liver king, like eat liver, take Fedogius agrestis or whatever, and that's the true answer, right? But yeah, I completely agree that, I think you do need to, again, we have highly inflammatory diets, lifestyles, we have a lot of stress factors in our life, that is gonna cause people to rebound to a depressed or anxious state if you don't kind of turn the dials to change your lifestyle. So, and some people won't respond. Again, in psychiatry, these are very large patient populations. I think a frustration is the way we diagnose mental health is very, very archaic. I think decades from now, we're going to look back at it and view it as, I don't want to use the word barbaric, but incredibly antiquated. That you take a survey and then we determine whether you're depressed or not. Like, the body only has a few ways to communicate that it's sick, but the underlying root causes can be very, very different. I mean, even within schizophrenia, there's 80 subtypes, we think, of schizophrenia. So it doesn't relate to psychedelics, but I think it's a clue that, you can get a lot of variability even within a specific indication. So, not everyone's going to respond. I do, everyone's kind of proselytizing about psychedelics. I can foresee media headlines in a year or two saying so-and-so, went in with high hopes and like they're worse off than when they started or things like that. And, we know how the media goes through these cycles. So I want to be a little cautious in some ways.
Well, this actually comes back to the point that you made and what we try to tell people all the time. Every single person is a individual. They have a very unique biochemistry. What works for one person doesn't work for another. I mean, I saw maybe it was a Business Insider article or Wall Street Journal article about ketamine use and talking about the problems that come from prolonged use and your inability to kind of like hold your urine in and become incontinent. And then the reality is, like, for some portion of people, it's going to happen. But for some other portion of people that have treatment-resistant depression that nothing else has worked for, it's going to change their life. And it's like that with any medication, right? If I take too much blood pressure medication, if I take too much Tylenol, I mean, you'll start to have those negative effects. What are two companies that you're particularly excited about? You're excited about all the companies in your portfolio. What are two and why?
Can I pick three?
Yeah, you can pick three.
All right, we'll do, again, I think kind of this forefront of next generation drug discovery is really, really fascinating. So, and I'll lay the groundwork for this answer, but you think, we're consuming a lot of the same drugs that people were in the 50s and 60s, but we don't drive the same cars. There's a lot of technology that we, developed then that we don't use now. Like that's evolved. So a lot of R&D was halted artificially by government fiat, but our capabilities in pharmacology, our capabilities in medicinal chemistry have far surpassed what they were back then. So I think there's a need for a catch-up in the psychedelic space to develop new drugs. And we kind of hit on that earlier. That's a lot of our bet. So, the companies doing that I think are really interesting. We are investors in Decoding Therapeutics. So they're working on, what they call psychoplastogens, really pursuing this neuroplasticity hypothesis, which I think is really compelling. And that would be a non-psychoactive medication, hits a lot of the same targets as traditional psychedelics do. And you think about the enhanced access of a medication like that. How many more patients can afford that? The likelihood of payers to reimburse that. It can be much more far-reaching is the nice thing. So that excites me. Like the issues of patient equity and patient accessibility are really important to me. So a lot of people will not be able to afford 6-hour long therapeutic sessions.
Hold on, what does a 6-hour long therapeutic session cost?
Well, they're saying for MDMA, the full bill, it's something like 20 to 25,000 is what they think. Now, the breakdown of like the actual cost of the drug versus how much is psychotherapy, which maybe you can bill that as talk therapy, I think that's getting hammered out. So does some get reimbursed? There's a lot up in the air. But as things stand, that's really expensive and time consuming too. It's tough for people to find that time to really carve out that space in their life. So, and psilocybin probably on par with that as well. So kind of similar time frames involved. So Delix is one, Gilgamesh is another one. They have a really interesting ketamine analog in their portfolio. Again, a non-dissociative analog of ketamine where you're not feeling the trippy effects. But there does seem to be, at least in animal models, it seems to be very, very compelling. So, I think that's also interesting. And then the last company, one we both know about, Tactogen as well, I think is interesting. So MDMA, great molecule, and I've had some great therapeutic sessions with it, but a lot of us can attest the come down, very gnarly for a lot of people. Kind of the 3-4 day just crazy depressed state. You're almost like, holy crap, was that worth it? So Tactogen is developing an analog of MDMA that extirpates those come down symptoms. There's also a bit during the session of you get less of the kind of euphoric rush, the vertiginous qualities, all of that, which can make it a more optimized experience. But I think that's really interesting. And it's not a scheduled compound, so the odds of it being more accessible to patients also very high, whereas MDMA is going to have a lot of controls around it. So you can kind of see the motif across some of these favorites. Our company's working on next-gen drugs with an optimized pharmacology, and the corollary to that is patient access and equity, that a lot more people will be able to access and afford those therapies, and those will be much more far-reaching.
Man, I'm excited. I'm so excited.
It's a cool future.
It is a very, very cool future. Well, listen, Tim, I really, really appreciate having you here. You guys are doing unbelievably great work, and I speak collectively excited that you decided to take the trip and decide to make this kind of your mission in your life.